Of all the sentient toys trying to use us for their own entertainment or to finally have a decent meal, the prototype is the one that should have everyone on edge, especially once we uncover the one reason why it's working so hard to keep us around. Poppy Playtime is yet another game following the pattern of creating an immense amount of lore that is then cut up and hidden throughout the game for the studious among us to then attempt to piece together. The mysterious toy known as Experiment 1006, the prototype, is becoming much more of an overarching force within the game as the chapters go on, and it's only going to get worse with the third chapter. So what exactly is the prototype? This mechanical monster, who right now has only appeared as a long mechanical arm, complete with a human ulna and radius attached to it, has been mentioned in several of the secret tapes dragged away the remains of Mommy Longlegs, and was actually with us during the final cutscene at the end of Chapter 2. So far from Chapter 2's tapes, we know that according to one of the researchers, the prototype possesses an unprecedented level of intelligence beyond that of all other experiments, as if we needed one more mastermind level threat to contend with, and has an alarming willingness to commit violence, as it turned an alarm clock into a laser pointer to play a trick on the researchers, and ended up in it killing an employee who it then added onto itself, hence the human bones attached to its arm. But much more interesting is actually Chapter 1's final tape, which may also be the final tape to be made at the factory, since we hear the researcher open with the words "final log," as we hear screams in the background coming from what must be the other researchers, on what seems to be the day that the toys overtook the factory. The researcher mentions that coordination and cooperation are clearly within his skill set, as well as within all other experiments of his type. Though still missing, today's events are no doubt in relation to him, making it sound like the prototype, a hyper-intelligent creation capable of coordinating and cooperating alongside others, is the one who, upon escape, pushed the other toys to cooperate and take down the employees, as it watched from the shadows. So what or who is the prototype? With Chapter 2's release, all of the main toys, as well as the little ones scattered throughout the factory, have been discovered to be the orphans that Playtime took in through its orphan program to feed their poppy flower experiments, and ultimately select a candidate to turn into each of their main toys, like Mommy Longlegs, who we know was a girl named Marie Payne, and Candy Cat, who may have once been an orphan named Michaela Hyssop, that Mommy Longlegs was helping through the game station's minigames. But this thing may not be an orphan like the other toys, based on when the orphan program began and when Experiment 1006 was created. And unlike my slip-ups in the last episode, where after pulling an all-nighter and heading off to the big trick show, where I had to be ready to present the parkour moves and tricks kids had learned to a mass of gazing parents, only to realize in my haste, I missed the obvious PJ Puggerpillar reference and called Mommy Longlegs a protagonist and not an antagonist. So let's get this one right, shall we? Thanks to the NFTs that Mob Games released, that we went over in our video about Mommy Longlegs' tragic story, we know when all of the toys were publicly released, with Poppy, Playtime's first successful toy, being released in 1950. And thanks to Chapter 2's first VHS tape, if Poppy, the human toy hybrid, is the founder Elliot Ludwig's deceased daughter, that would mean that she wasn't turned into a toy until sometime later after her death in the 1960s. Possibly not even until the 70s, depending upon how long the research took, giving us a rough estimate and a timeline for when Playtime began successfully turning kids into toys. This would also mean that Mommy Longlegs, known as Experiment 1222, was created around the 70s or even 80s, sometime after Huggy Wuggy or Experiment 1170, and before Candy Cat, as they were still searching for a suitable candidate. Other than that, the rest of the timeline for events in this game is rough at best, seeing how little concrete dates we have to go off of. We don't come to the factory until 10 years later, after it's shut down, and Playtime had successfully created a living version of every toy. For us, it could currently be the 90s or the early 2000s, giving Playtime scientists a 20 to 30-ish year span for creating all of these living toys. But the prototype, or Experiment 1006, on the other hand, was created before all of the other toys, with the exception of Poppy. But then again, maybe Poppy wasn't first. The only similarity between Poppy and the prototype is that, unlike the other toys, neither of them need to eat. As is said in Chapter 1 about 1006, and seeing how Poppy was trapped inside of her glass case for a really long time. But it's the prototype's low experiment number number, and the fact that when Elliot Ludwig began experimenting on orphans for the sake of reviving his own daughter, why would he start with his own daughter until he was sure that the experiments would work? And sure enough, in a note he left on his desk, he writes about his frustration with his 814 failed rat experiments, and says that perhaps something larger than a rat would yield different test results. This is when Playtime hired Warren Bach Construction to build a secret lab for human testing in 12 months' time, and the most likely time for Elliot to open Playtime's orphan program that preceded every living toy experiment. So from experiment 815 onwards, after nearly 200 failed human trials, the researchers successfully merged a human, an orphan, with a toy for the first time. Except this experiment was incredibly violent, intelligent, and refused to follow the researchers' orders, causing them to detain it in a room for further observation. Soon after this breakthrough, the researchers brought Elliot's dream to life, transferring his daughter's consciousness into a Poppy doll. But for Playtime, they had their own dream and continued the experiments for decades to come. But why? Why keep the experiments going? Money? No. I believe the researchers were driven by something much greater. When listening more closely to the researcher's last words in Chapter 1's final tape, he says, "I'm not worried about myself. One breakthrough and I'll be back." Odd thing to say when you know you're about to be torn apart by a living children's toy. Unless the researchers were close to discovering how to truly bring the dead back to life using poppy flowers. That while they were busy making living toys to fund the machine that is Playtime, they were really researching the prospect of immortality. But Experiment 1006 took all that away from them when it had the other toys take over the factory. But then again, maybe it didn't, and the researchers were closer than we think. Whenever we get caught by one of the animatronics, I mean toys, instead of being met with a game over screen, we instead see the phrases, "Get up, don't die just yet, it's not your time, death isn't permanent." Using poppy flowers from the rat experiments all the way up to 1006 and Poppy's creation, the researchers were driven to uncover the secret to how to bring a deceased individual back to life, possibly healing whatever injuries they may have had before. Seeing how each time we are literally torn apart, we're told to get back up and throw ourselves back in there, because someone, namely Poppy, needs us alive. Thank you, science. But Poppy's not the only one who needs us to fulfill their plans. And just like when I decided to figure out how to YouTube better, creating an educational channel after one I used to listen to while mopping the floors of the martial arts studio I worked at, what is the prototype's motive in all of this? What is its endgame? You know, earlier when I said, watching your every move, oh boy did I mean it, because there's reason to believe that Experiment 1006 has been following us around for quite some time. Wasn't it pretty convenient that 1006 happened to be right there to collect Mommy Longlegs? And not only that, as soon as we got onto the train to escape the factory, once Poppy tells us that she can't let us leave because we're too perfect to lose, she is cut off mid-sentence by the sound of a digital alarm clock, with Poppy quickly saying, "What?" before she's suddenly silenced, and the train speeds out of control, as if it was tampered by something intelligent enough to do so. Whether we were going to make a beeline for the exit, or if Poppy was going to change our course to some other part of the factory, we were never going to get out. 1006 continued to follow us around, hopping on the train with us, only to tamper with it, sending it out of control, ensuring that we stay within the factory to complete its plan. The plan that seems to be made obvious by the fact that 1006 is shown and said to be collecting the parts of whatever it can find, allowing it to grow stronger and eventually truly take over or even escape the factory. But right now, it's too weak to confront any of the other toys, and perhaps even us, a lonely human. So 1006 needs us to stay and finally be the one to bring the other toys down, allowing it to assemble itself into something much more formidable, while Poppy, on the other hand, needs us to bring a stop to the killing of her fellow toys, and possibly bring an end to Experiment 1006, who started the chaos in the first place. But if none of this was very convincing, then I saved my most interesting piece of evidence for last. Despite Poppy keeping us in the factory for seemingly benevolent reasons, telling us to trust her, at Chapter 2's end she still asks us a question about Mommy Longlegs, saying, "Did you kill her? Good." Showing that Poppy's intentions for how to resolve all the terrible things might not be too different from the prototypes. So what's your trick to piecing this whole thing together? Which which I do in my Poppy Playtime series. See you in the next one.